Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which I live and meet you from tonight, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, as well as to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the wider community and who may be with us tonight. I acknowledge that the land on which I meet you from is stolen land and that Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded and treaties are yet to be negotiated. I additionally acknowledge the Wurundjeri people's living culture, knowledge and struggle in this region. By way of introduction, my name is Denise Adinas and I am the President of NUGAS Victoria, and together with our Vice President Eleni Zifas, we will be chairing tonight's seminar, which is part one of our crash course on the Greek War of Independence between history and myth history. For those of you who don't know what NUGAS is, we are the National Union of Greek Australian Students. In short, we're a student-led non-profit organisation with a place within the Greek community of Victoria and Australia for the past 50 years. First and foremost, I would like to thank our speaker for the night, Yianni Cartledge, for his tireless efforts and great research undertaken to present us all with this informative seminar. I would also like to thank the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne and Victoria, and especially Nick Dallas for making this event possible. I would like to make a quick note of the fact that as our community evolves and grows, the ties between us, the Greek youth of today, and our predecessors and organisations such as the GCM is of paramount importance. And for that, we are really thrilled about this collaboration on such an important topic. By way of housekeeping, could I please ask that you all remain muted while the speakers are talking and that you refrain from sending through questions until we near the end of the seminar, and please do send them through the chat only. We've set aside ample time at the end of the seminar for all questions to be answered. And now I will pass you on to Bill Papastadiadis to say a few words. Over to you, Bill.
Wonderful. And thank you so much for that introduction, Denise. And I want to congratulate NUGAS for reaching out and suggesting and being proactive and interested in this project. This is an ideal concept which to commence basically the commemoration of our 200 years since independence of our motherland. And it's important for the Greek community of Melbourne, our organisation, to work as facilitators with NUGAS, who are really forcing the change within our community ideas, and which is challenging the notions and understanding of who we are as a community, but more importantly, gaining some understanding about our own history through the wonderful insights we will have tonight through Yianni Cartledge, who will talk about history and myth history. So the pursuit of history and knowledge really does make us better individuals and people and community persons. I too want to thank the co-chairs of the 1821 committee, Marini Papyrus and Michael Keramidos, Nick Dallas, who's the seminar convener, yourself, Denise, for your enthusiasm and direction and vigour, and equally your Vice President, Eleni Zifas, who's also with us. And lastly, but not obviously not least, Yianni Cartledge, who we will all be enthralled to hear more about his insight in terms of, the 200-year celebrations that will be experiencing through the course of this year, but which will be highlighted today in his presentation. So welcome to everyone. We hope that this collaboration continues, and have a great night. And I'm looking forward to myself learning a lot more about this wonderful, not centenary, but basically bicentenary.
Thank you, Bill. I will now pass over to Nick Dallas to give a few words.
Thank you, Bill and Denise. Good evening, kalispera sas, kali chronia. Greetings to everyone, and a special welcome to those who may be tuning into a GCM event for the first time. Normally, these events would be held in the more socially user-friendly mezzanine level of the Greek Centre, but we're living in unusual times at the moment. Firstly, allow me to applaud NUGAS for reaching out to the Greek community to organise this 2-week crash course, and to further thank our speaker tonight, Yianni Cartledge, for taking the time over this summer to put these presentations together. Thank you again, Yianni. This year, Greece celebrates 200 years as a modern nation state, and what a turbulent, calamitous, but also eventful 200 years it's been. Spurred on by ideas evolving from the Enlightenment on how a state should be organised, the modern nation state is only a concept a few centuries old, and many might be surprised that Greece is even older than states like Italy and Germany in this respect. The point of this crash course is to give viewers an overview of the main themes, events and issues around not only the 1821 War of Independence, but also the lead up to this event and the immediate follow through in the ensuing decades. There may be things missed out. Sorry, I correct that. There will be things missed out. Where does one draw the cutoff line in terms of content to include? There really is so much. There will be things you're hearing for the first time. Other descriptions might coincide with things that you know. And there might even be things you disagree with. That's history. It's messy. It's complex. Individuals and protagonists are complex. They evolve. They're contradictory during the course of time. You give a historian the same set of facts and they'll come up with a different narrative. The aim of this course is to stimulate your interest in this period. If you find some facts and themes fascinating and you're provoked in delving into them deeper in your own time, then we've succeeded with our aims. Becoming more knowledgeable about history, any type of history, can only make you a more well-rounded individual as one tackles life. From March onwards, a seminar program kicks off where half the themes relate to the 1821 War of Independence. Have a look at it. We will be posting. It's on the Greek community website. NUGAS has also posted as well. We've gone out of our way to attract and include global experts in this field. We're honoured that they've accepted an invitation to participate. We're also hoping that many of you in today's crash course will be encouraged to attend some of these topic-specific seminars to enhance your knowledge. Happy listening and enjoy the next hour.
Good evening, everyone. As Denise previously mentioned, my name is Eleni Zifas and I'm Vice President of NUGAS. This two-part series looks at the Greek War of Independence from a range of critical perspectives. Part 1, tonight's lecture, examines the relevant background knowledge of the revolution, establishing Greece and the Greek people's place in the Ottoman Empire, Europe, and the world during the 18th and early 19th centuries. These include important periods such as the Modern Greek Enlightenment, as well as the rise of revolutionary ideas and nationalism in the Balkans. The question of who is a Greek is also unravelled, helping contextualise the beginnings of the Uprising. Part 1 then explores the beginnings of the revolution and the initial outbreak. Part 2 will then deal with the War of Independence itself, including, but not limited to, the massacres, the Civil War, the Egyptian invasion, and Navarino. It will then cap the study off with the aftermath of the war and its modern legacy. Although much is covered, this series hopes to provide a diverse range of perspectives, ideas, and meanings, and to help build a constructive discussion of the war on its 200th anniversary. Our speaker tonight is Yianni Cartledge, candidate for PhD at Flinders University, South Australia. Having a passion for Greek, Ottoman, British, and Australian histories, as well as migration and diaspora histories, his current project aims to combine all these areas. The thesis, titled Aegean Islander Migration to the UK and Australia, 1815 to 1945, Immigration, Settlement, Community Building and Integration, will investigate the cases of the Heaths of London and the Carians of South Australia. His 2018 honours thesis explored the 1822 Chios massacre under the Ottoman Empire and the ways in which it affected British attitudes towards the Greeks, leading to Christian humanitarian intervention. An article deriving from his thesis titled The Chios Massacre 1822 and Early British Christian Humanitarianism was published in February 2020 in Historical Research. He recently published a biographical entry of South Australian fisherman and seafood merchant George Agelakis in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. Now, without further ado, here is Yianni Cartledge.
Okay, just firstly, Thanks for introducing me, guys. I'd like to start off by firstly acknowledging country. So I acknowledge that I am giving this presentation from the lands of the Kaurna people and that we respect the spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all live. Today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this seminar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to their lands and waters. Secondly, I would like to thank NUGAS and the Greek community of Melbourne, especially Nick Dallas for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this lecture series, and Denise and Eleni and the whole NUGAS Victoria team for helping organise the event. I'd also like to thank Bill for coming on and joining us as well. So I'd like to start off with a bit of an anecdote about identity. So growing up as Greek Australians, many of us hear a very repetitive narrative of Greek independence. We are taught of the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, 400 years of slavery, and then a glorious battle for freedom leading to the creation of modern Greece. While there is definitely some truth to this narrative, we have to remember that like any other event in world history, things are not so straightforward or cut and dried. Like any war or revolution, there is a range of nuanced and differing opinions, as well as conflicting facts and ideas, many of which may challenge our own image of Greek independence. In recent years, we have challenged the narrative of colonial settlement in Australia, and many of us now learn a broader and more critical history of Australia's beginnings, rather than the myths of a peaceful colonisation in a country that was terra nullius or nobody's land. Similarly, Greek theorist Stathis Gourgouris, in his book Dream Nation, challenges the story of Greek independence, calling it a myth history, a mix of myth and history. So in this two-part series, I hope to present to you a broader view of the Greek War of Independence that might differ from what we learnt in our childhoods, as well as split some of the myths from the realities. This is by no means a complete overview, and I apologise if I leave out any key points, which I'm sure I will, as well as people, events, and ideas. And I'm hoping that this will rather spur on some thought and deeper research into the realities surrounding the Greek Revolution. So from Byzantine to Ottoman was the big transition that happened to the land that would become modern Greece. So some scholars view this modern Greek nation as a successor to the medieval Byzantine Empire, centered on modern-day Istanbul. The Byzantine Empire was, in reality, the Eastern Roman Empire, and included most parts of modern-day Greece, Turkey, the Middle East, and Northeast Africa. The language of use for the empire is called Medieval Greek. Medieval Greek developed from Koine Greek, and it was the language of the New Testament. The Orthodox Church was also the center point for the Byzantines, especially after the Great Schism with the Catholic Church in 1054. However, the empire's people were still very much Roman and saw themselves that way, as they had since the schism of the Catholic Church. So, however, the empire's people were still very much orthodox in their religious beliefs. So, during the Byzantine era, the idea of Hellas or Ellada was something connected with Greece's ancient pagan past, and terms like Hellenes had not been used since the Christianization under Constantine the Great. So an independent Hellenic identity was yet to exist at this point. So in 1453, Istanbul was captured by the quickly growing Ottoman Empire under Mehmed II, the Conqueror, marking the end of the Roman Empire. The Ottoman conquest, however, was not the downfall of Eastern Rome, but rather was a capitalization on an already weak Byzantine Empire. So prior to 1453, in 1204, the Fourth Crusade, led by the Venetians, French, and Holy Roman Empire, and called by Pope Innocent III, had captured and plundered Constantinople, which this weakened the Byzantine Empire, leaving its capital vulnerable to further attacks, such as from the Ottomans. So the Ottomans themselves, they originated as a series of nomadic tribes that were migrating from Central Asia into Anatolia, the Caucasus and the Middle East during the Middle Ages. By the 11th century, one group, the Seljuk Turks, had emigrated en masse into modern-day Turkey and dominated the region. In Anatolia, the Turks mixed with the local Anatolian populations and they became a distinct ethnicity. And in the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire had risen to power after the fall of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, also known as Rome, which dominated Asia Minor from the 11th to 14th centuries. So the region's new sultanate took the name Ottoman from the first sultan, Osman, and his dynasty that followed. Osman himself was originally a tribal leader, or beylik, who quickly began conquering his neighboring principalities and towns in Anatolia. From the empire's beginnings, the Ottomans ruled both Christians and Muslim populations, and with many of Osman's personal followers being Christian. So after the fall of Constantinople, Mehmed II opted to maintain some normality in day-to-day life for former Byzantine citizens that he now ruled. So Christian and Jewish Ottomans, who were seen as sharing a religion with common origins to Islam, lived under the dhimmi, or protected system of government. They were restricted from carrying weapons and riding horses, and they also had to pay a jizya tax. However, they were not restricted from practicing their religions or speaking their language, and in fact, Greek remained the commercial language of the Mediterranean for some time. Another part of the dhimmi privileges was that Christian Ottomans were also exempt from military service, although this did not include the Janissary Corps, who under different Ottoman administrations were known to have kidnapped and recruited young children to be trained amongst their ranks. By the 16th century, much of the Byzantine ruling class had also been incorporated into the Ottoman government, and many had converted to Islam. So there's a good chapter there by Heath Lowry that talks about this. So the restrictions on Christians and other minorities, however, did vary throughout different periods in Ottoman history and under different sultans. So the 18th century saw a dramatic and revolutionary change in the world. This was first realized through the beginnings of the Age of Enlightenment, where new philosophical and religious ideas were being explored openly, including the ideas of liberty, progress, religious tolerance, and the scientific method. These ideas guided the 18th century and the centuries to come. Through the philosophers and thinkers such as John Locke and Pierre Bayle, the ideas of separation of church and state were also explored. The Enlightenment coincided with, and no doubt was connected to, two major revolutions. So firstly, the Industrial Revolution of the 1760s. This introduced large-scale manufacturing and production to the world, as well as encouraged urbanization, so the mass movements of people from rural villages and farming communities to big cities. Secondly, the French Revolution questioned the feudal establishment of Europe and used the Enlightenment's ideals as its motto: liberty, equality, fraternity. Here in Australia, we usually explore both these revolutions in our schooling, the industrial and the French, where they're tied to the creation of the modern world. So Eric Hobsbawm, in his book, The Age of Revolution, called this period the greatest transformation in human history since the remote times, when men invented agriculture. So in Ottoman Greece, these new ideas were expressed in the Modern Greek Enlightenment and at the end of the 18th century. So for us, it is important to see that the Greek Revolution arrived on the back of this period. So the Modern Greek Enlightenment was a period of increased trade and education among Orthodox Christian Ottomans. So merchant class Greeks, especially those living in the Fenar quarter of Istanbul, known as Fenariots, began building stronger networks around the Mediterranean Sea and beyond, becoming both wealthier and more influential. So this increased wealth allowed many Greeks, especially Fenariots, to begin sending their children for education in Europe's most prestigious schools and universities. Another focus of the Modern Greek Enlightenment was the uniformity of the Greek language. Before this period, a variety of Greek-based dialects were spoken throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Some of them are very distinct and probably quite foreign to our idea of modern Greek. However, during the Enlightenment period, questions of unifying these dialects into one common language were explored. There was, however, an already existing common language, used most often for trade and commerce, called Dimotiki. This was a naturally evolving version of the Greek language that had much influence from Ottoman Turkish, Italian, and other languages. Although many of the wealthier and more educated Greeks, especially the Phanariots, were supporters of the language, having closer ties with the classical Greek of the ancient world and less influential, they wanted less influence from foreign languages, which were seen as vulgarities. Adamantios Korais, a Greek scholar living in Paris, answered this call and developed the Katharevousa version of the Greek language. Katharevousa meaning cleansed. This became the official language of the modern Greece movement. Despite the popularity of Katharevousa among elites, the average Orthodox Ottoman still spoke their own dialect until well after Greek independence. So usage of Katharevousa over Dimotiki would be a debate that lasted well into the 20th century, until Dimotiki finally won out as Greece's national language in 1967. So following the century of Enlightenment, the 19th century saw the rise of nationalist movements in the Balkans and also all over Europe. These movements, stemming from the developments over the last 2 centuries, saw a new way of viewing the world around them. Rather than existing within large, multicultural, multilingual, and multi-religious empires, nationalists hoped to construct nations. These were entities which shared a common language, culture, and religion, as well as a defined border. To achieve their dreams, nations had to be constructed as they had not formed naturally in the multicultural Balkans. The theorist Benedict Anderson called nations imagined communities, where different national identities could be constructed and employed depending on the region's context. Many of these members of these imagined communities share a perception of a common culture, language, and historical myth, despite the actual historical reality. Australia is an example of this. So, as before Federation in 1901, a united Australian national identity did not exist. This had to be constructed and centered on the narrative of discovery and settlement, despite the historical realities of these events. So this is similar for Greece. So for the possibility of a Greek nation, nationalist thinkers such as Korais, Phareos, and others had to combine Greece's ancient classical and pagan past with their Orthodox Christian present to build a new Hellenic identity. So this type of thinking has become known to historians as Neo-Hellenism. These Neo-Hellenists introduced the ancient terms of Hellas and Hellenic, applying them to the current Greek-speaking Ottomans, who were generally known as Romi, which meant Roman. Greece was not the first nationalist revolution in the Balkans for the century, however. The Serbian Revolution, which was a series of uprisings against the Ottomans, spanning from 1804 to 1835, saw Serbian nationalist thinkers and idealists, inspired similarly by the Enlightenment, revolt against the Ottoman Empire in the hope of creating an independent Serbian nation. This revolution culminated in the creation of the Serbian Principality in 1815, which lasted until 1882, when it became the Kingdom of Serbia. So with this in mind, the question really became, who was a Greek? So in reality, an independent Greece and a Greek nationality had not uniformly existed since the time of Alexander the Great's empire and his successor kingdoms. The terms for Greek were, such as Greki and Ellinas, were revived through the Enlightenment. So both Greek or Grekos and Hellenes or Hellenes are derived from tribal names used in ancient Greek literature. However, since the Christianization of the Roman Empire, both these terms became associated with paganism and fell out of use. The people that would become modern Greeks were rather known as Romi or Romans throughout the Middle Ages and through the Ottoman period. In the Ottoman era, this name was not unique for just Greek-speaking peoples, and any Christian Ottoman could have used this term. So the term even survived into the 20th century, especially as many parts of modern Greece were still under Ottoman rule up until World War I. For example, my own great-grandparents, who were born in the 1900s and 1910s on the island of Ikaria, just off the Turkish coast, referred to themselves as Romi as late as the 1940s. Many Pontian Greeks also used this term well into the 20th century. instead of the more modern geographical term of Pontian. Even now, in recent times, some of the Pontian diaspora in Central Asia and the Caucasus still refer to themselves as Romi. In all, many of the famous figures of the Greek War of Independence were not by our typical ideas Greek, but came from a range of ethnic backgrounds, including the Albanian-speaking Arvanites, the Vlachs, and who spoke a Romanian language similar to Romanian. So the modern usage of Greek or Hellenas really implied an Orthodox Christian of the former Ottoman Empire, and is actually a more ambiguous identity than we originally taught to believe. So pre-revolution, the land that would become Greece was divided between the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, and various autonomous regions. The Ottoman region that incorporated mainland Greece was known as Rumelia, or Land of the Romans. The Ionian Islands were an autonomous entity until the turn of the 19th century, and they were called the Septinsular Republic. They then transitioned to French control and finally British, which lasted until 1864. Other regions remained relatively autonomous. Many islands self-governed for most of their history and were only Ottoman in name only. Even after the revolution, the map would remain diverse and Greece would not exist in its current boundaries until 1947. So the key foreshadowing of the Greek Revolution can be seen as far back as 1774, where Russia signed the Treaty of Küçükkanatsa with the Ottoman Empire, ending the Russo-Turkish War of 1768. In the treaty, Russia promised protection for Christians living within the Ottoman Empire, as well as secured the right for a new Orthodox Church in Istanbul. So I've put the articles from the treaty that were quoted here. So in reality, the new church was never built. However, the treaty was a turning point for Orthodox Ottomans, such as the Greeks, as it brought them to the forefront of European politics. This would play into the beginnings of the revolution. So the 1820s in Europe was really a revolutionary decade, and not just in Europe, in the wider world. A revolutionary wave struck and it spanned Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and Russia. In 1820, militants in Spain demanded a shift to constitutional monarchy, and this was successful in 1823, and the period is known in Spanish history as Trienio Liberal. Two more constitutionalist revolutions occurred. In 1820, one beginning in Portugal, which partly caused Brazil to declare independence, and another in what would later become Italy, so between the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Sardinia, and Northern Italy. Following these revolutions, the Greek War of Independence would be seen as a timely addition to the decade. Later in the decade, in 1825, Russia suppressed its Decembrist revolution, and Argentina similarly coupled with a Decembrist revolution in 1828. So this period certainly was a culmination of the Enlightenment's revolutionary ideas, which had spoken to an inherent need for self-governance in the world. It was also a precursor to the slow move away from imperialism, which became a focus of the 20th century. So the origins of the Greek Revolution notably came from the already mentioned Phanariots and Greeks living abroad in Europe. So the diaspora Greek communities started their quest for Greek independence on the back of the ideologies of the Enlightenment. They soon formed the Society of Friends, the Philiki Eteria. This was a secret society aimed at spurring on a revolution. The society was founded by 3 Greek merchants living in Odessa in modern-day Ukraine, but then part of the Russian Empire. These merchants, Nikolaos Skoufas, Emmanuel Xanthos, and Athanasios Tsakalov, based the Philiki Eteria off Western Freemasonry and looked to expand their ideologies forward. In 1818, the organization moved to Istanbul and was headed by the Phanariot Alexander Ypsilantis. So a notable myth that came from this period is that Greek culture, language, and national identity was kept alive via underground secret schools run by Orthodox priests. In reality, Greeks could practice their religion relatively freely, and the Greek language was kept alive as it was the common language of business and trade for the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Greek textbooks in Greece have now removed the teaching of secret schools, considering it a fictitious national memory. This is certainly a myth I had learnt younger, but however, it actually has no basis in history and is rather part of the mythistory surrounding Greek independence. In a way, it helped to build a stronger image of oppression in the independence narrative. There's an article recently well, somewhat recently, in the Financial Times here by Thanasis Kampagiannis, which talks about the secret schools as a nationalist myth. So Islamic Ottoman rule was not the only governance Greeks experienced during the Ottoman period. Local Christian rulers were also put in charge of towns, villages, regions, and islands in the empire. These Christian elites were known under many names in Greek, which I've listed here, and they would work alongside Ottoman governors. So usually these local rulers were already of significant status in their communities, such as of the Greek merchant class or the phanariots. In some regions, these positions were elected. This was especially the case for the islands, such as in Chios, who had at least 4 elected demogerontes at any one time. In other regions of Greece, the Christian rulers were directly appointed by the Ottomans themselves, and the title became hereditary. Many of these local rulers, however, were not always in favor of their fellow Christians and were considered another layer of oppression that were more often evident and apparent in the less populated regions than the Islamic Ottoman elites, who were not always concerned with small-scale local issues. So on occasion, Ottoman officials would even have to intervene and relieve the local Greeks from tyranny imposed by their appointed Greek rulers. There was a recent article by Babis Stavropoulos in Neos Kosmos that discussed this. So during the Greek War of Independence, the local Greek rulers were a controversial force. On the island of Chios in 1822, for example, the demogerontes were blamed for an invasion of Greek forces, causing an insurrection and mass violence that had been aimed at stirring revolutionary ideas on the island. There was a second type of local Greek ruler, however, and these were not appointed by the Ottomans. The Clefs, or Klefti, literally meaning thieves or brigands, were anti-Ottoman Greek insurgents who were self-governed and living in the mountains of mainland Greece. So their retreat into the mountains began from the 15th century. However, many outcasts and fugitives of various backgrounds contributed to the Clef population over the centuries. For much of the Ottoman period, the Clefs acted as highwaymen. They robbed passerbyers and lived in their own governmental code, which was a unique kinship system similar to the Albanian cultural idea of Besa, meaning honor. So many of the well-known figures of the revolution, such as the Kolokotronis family and Karaskakis, were Clefs. During the revolution, the Clefs would behave as a type of guerrilla force, using their knowledge of their home regions to their advantage. This here is a shadow puppet depicting a cleft, and that's held at the British Museum. So the outbreak of the war. The Greek War of Independence is officially taught as beginning in the Morea region of the Ottoman Empire, which is the modern-day Peloponnese, on the 25th of March, 1821. However, the first moves towards independence were actually carried out by the Phanariot Alexander Ypsilantis, pictured here, leader of the Philiki Eteria. And this was in the Danubian Principalities in late February and early March 1821. So the Danubian Principalities were Wallachia and Moldavia, and they consisted of modern-day Romania and Moldova, and they were paying tribute to the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, they had large Orthodox Christian populations, and many of them spoke both Greek and Romanian. The principalities were also under administration of Phanariots, who had emigrated to the region in the previous centuries. So Ypsilantis and the Philiki Eteria saw the opportunity to begin their revolution in these regions, which were at the empire's extremities. So in 1820, Ypsilantis, who was the son of the former governor of Wallachia, initially established his camp at the Russian towns of Izmail and Kishinev, both close to the Danube River and the border with Moldavia. Here he planned his move into the provinces. Kishinev, which is modern-day Chisinau, is the capital of Moldova, and it was extremely close to Iași, the Moldavian capital, during the Ottoman period. On the 6th of March 1821, after months of planning, Ypsilantis, along with two of his younger brothers, as well as a Wallachian Russian colonel called Kantakuzinos, and as well as a handful of servants, crossed the river and proclaimed revolution. The group, citing the Russian promise of protection, claimed that 70,000 Russian troops were on their way as support and that independence from the Ottomans was imminent. The group also had the support of local Romanian revolutionary Tudor Vladimirescu, who himself had a vision for a united Romanian nation. So Ypsilantis' false confidence managed to gather supporters, and soon he had a force of 2,000 revolutionaries, with a quarter coming from outside of the region. With his force, Ypsilantis slowly marched towards the capital of Bucharest, spreading revolutionary fervor. On reaching Bucharest, Ypsilantis found that Vladimirescu had already seized the capital, and his own force, had seized the capital with his own force, and they were anti-Phanariot administration. So by April, the Ottomans had sent a retaliation force to recover the provinces, and with a lack of Russian support for the revolution, the Ottomans quickly disbanded Ypsilantis and Vladimirescu's armies and aspirations. As historian Brewer noted, all that Ypsilantis' expedition had achieved was proof of a certain uncomfortable facts, that to win independence, the Greeks were going to need the help of outside powers, and that this help would not be easily forthcoming. However, the event also hinted at the first successes towards the united Romanian national identity and the creation of modern Romania, which did not finally eventuate until more than 50 years later, between 1877 and 78. So, following Ypsilantis' revolt, in mid to late March of 1821, revolution broke out profoundly in the Peloponnese, known as the Ottoman province of Morea. As news of Ypsilantis' march along the Danube reached the Peloponnesian leaders, tensions grew in the already tense and revolutionary-minded Peloponnese. War was first declared against the Ottomans by the Maniots of Areopoli under command of Petrobey Mavromichalis. The Maniots were a very independent people, and they saw the opportunity to march on the stronghold city of Kalamata, while Ottoman troops were preoccupied elsewhere. Other Peloponnesian leaders did the same, such as the Clef Kolokotronis, his nephew Nigetaras, and the outspoken priest and Filiki Eteria member known as Papa Flessas, who with their forces all joined the Maniots in sieging Kalamata. So by the 23rd of March, Kalamata was under control of the revolutionaries, and the Greek War of Independence from the Ottomans was officially declared 2 days later on the 25th of March, a day still celebrated in Greece today. The day itself, however, is another example of the myth history of the revolution. So despite the Danubian revolts and the Maniots declaring war earlier in the month, and Kalamata being taken on the 23rd, the 25th of March has been chosen as a day of commemoration for the Greeks. Many scholars see this day as coinciding with the religious feast of Annunciation, making the day both a holy day and a national holiday, which plays into the folklore surrounding the Greek Revolution. So the myth history surrounding the day is usually attributed to the priest Iomanos III of Old Patras, also known as Palion Patron Iomanon, who supposedly blessed the flag and the day and proclaimed the beginnings of the uprisings on the 25th. So a factor that contributed to the success of the revolution's outbreak was the Ottoman-Persian War, also known as the Turco-Iranian War. So during 1821, the Persian crown prince Abbas Mirza invaded Western Armenia and modern-day Azerbaijan with 30,000 troops at the instigation of the Russian Empire. The Ottomans sent 50,000 troops to counter the Persians, and by 1823, the Ottomans had successfully pushed back Mirza and held their possessions in eastern Anatolia. This 3-year-long war divided Ottoman troops, resources, and attentions, giving the Greeks a halved Ottoman force to contend with. So this certainly helped solidify the Greek revolutionaries' positions, especially in the isolated regions where the revolution was growing, such as the Peloponnese. Other contributing factors at the same time was the destruction of the Janissary Corps, where the Ottoman elite Janissary soldiers revolted against the Sultan, weakening the Ottoman forces severely. An increased decentralization of Ottoman administration in places like Egypt and Epirus also contributed to lessening impact of the Ottoman army. So before next week, I'd like to set up some of the key figures of the revolution. So there were many key figures with names that have almost been mythicized in Greek folklore. So these characters shaped the outcome of the war, as well as they also represented the different factions that arose during it. So yeah, I'll briefly introduce a few of these figures today who I think are worth mentioning, and their backgrounds will hopefully give context to the different factions involved in the revolution. Firstly, I'd like to talk about the Ypsilantis family, who were a family of Phanariots living between Istanbul and the Danubian provinces. So two in particular became main players in the revolution, the brothers Alexandros and Dimitrios. So Alexandros was the leader of the Philikieteria and, as already discussed, led the initial revolt in Moldavia and Wallachia. His brother Dimitrios, who had previously served in the Russian Imperial Army, would become a revolutionary Greek general during the war. The Ypsilantis family represented a more privileged class of Greeks that had more akin to Ottoman-appointed local rulers than the more agrarian and farming-minded Orthodox Christians. The second character I'd like to introduce is Kolokotronis, who was one of the most prominent Greek generals during the war. In contrast to the wealthy Phanariot leaders, Kolokotronis was from a family of Clefs who held revolutionary sympathies for generations. Kolokotronis organized one of the earliest Greek forces and would lead much of the war in the Peloponnese. He and the Clefs are examples of the self-organized guerrilla faction that sought to break the hierarchical structures, including the Ottoman-appointed elites and the locally appointed Greek Orthodox rulers, who were often portrayed as decadent and oppressive themselves. The third person I'd like to introduce is Laskarina Bouboulina. She was born in Istanbul and was actually of Albanian-speaking Arvaniti heritage. A member of the Philikieteria, Bouboulina became an admiral in the Russian Imperial Navy. She then became a naval commander as part of the Greek revolutionary effort. So Bouboulina financed her own ship, the Agamemnon, and was a key part of Greece's naval success. Bouboulina can be seen as an outsider in the revolution and in a sense walked the line between the two revolutionary factions. Bouboulina is also an example of the prominence of non-Greek speaking revolutionaries. So the Albanian-speaking Arvanites, who Bouboulina was a member of, were descendants of Albanian immigrants during the Middle Ages and had large populations in Athens, Hydra, and southern Greece. In fact, at the time of Greek independence, Albanian, or Arvanitika, could have been the most commonly spoken language in Athens, but Athens did only have a population of 4,000 people at this point. So many of the revolutionary figures, especially from Hydra and Attica, were Arvanites, and following independence, much of the Arvanite population assimilated into the new Greek life, learning Greek and having a staunch Hellenic identity. It would not be fitting, however, to not look at the Ottoman leaders and their perspectives on the war. So Mahmud II was the empire's 30th sultan, pictured here. He had inherited the position from his half-brother, Mustafa IV, in 1808, after a bloody royal family dispute. So Mustafa IV had originally ordered the execution of the young Mahmud. However, a coup led by Alamdar Mustafa Pasha deposed Mustafa IV, allowing Mahmud to inherit the throne. So the Greek War of Independence was not the only revolution or war Mahmud contended with during his long reign, and the list includes a war with the Saudi state, the Russo-Turkish War, the Ottoman-Persian War, the French conquest of Ottoman Algeria, and the infamous destruction of the Janissaries. Mahmud also passed many reforms, such as the Tanzimat reforms, which will be discussed next week, and Mahmud II's reign was marked by large losses and the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's decline. Many historians do not blame him personally for these events, but rather see it as a shifting climate in world diplomacy that saw Enlightenment ideals and revolutionary fervor spread throughout much of the world. The last person I'd like to introduce is a key Ottoman figure, Nasuzadeh Ali Pasha, known as Kara Ali. He was one of Mahmud's key admirals during the early stages of the revolution. Kara Ali was responsible for some of the most infamous acts of the Ottoman fleet, and he will be discussed further next week in the context of the war's opening events. As will other key players such as Kapodistrias, Mavrocordatos, the Kunturiotis family, and Karaskakis, as well as Muhammad Ali Pasha and Ibrahim Pasha of Egypt. Before finishing, I will like to cap off today's discussion with a brief look at the role of the Orthodox Church in both the Ottoman Empire and through the revolution. So the church was clearly a key element for Greek national identity, and a driving force behind Greek nationalist sentiment. During the Ottoman period, since the reign of Sultan Mehmed II, the head of the Orthodox Church, the ecumenical patriarch, was situated at Istanbul, as he is today. And he was seen as the spiritual head of the Christian minority of Rumelia. The church had a very sporadic relationship with the empire, and some patriarchs were executed and others were embraced at different times in Ottoman history and under different administrations. So this led to much of the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church to remain loyal to the Ottomans or to take their time before choosing which side to support. This was because the church hierarchy was essentially a privileged class that enjoyed a comfortable life under Ottoman administration. Some priests, however, such as those living in isolated regions, especially of the lower levels in the clergy, were staunch supporters of independence, and this created a divide of opinion amongst the church as a whole. Notably, in 1822, the churches on the mainland of Greece were incorporated into the new Church of Greece. So this was a Greek government-controlled church that was not centered on Istanbul, but rather on Athens. So the Church of Greece would remain part of the Greek Orthodox Communion. However, this division was the first of many separating factors that separated Ottoman Greeks from the newly formed Greek nation. With all this in mind, the scene is now set for next week, where we'll explore some of the key events that shaped the war, as well as its outcome, aftermath, and legacy. Thank you for listening, guys.
Thank you very much, Yianni. That was a really great and informative seminar, and I'm sure all of our viewers and listeners tuning in would agree. You've provided a really good context and background to this topic, so thank you for that. We'll begin with our questions. Our first question is from Konstantinos Spiropoulos, and he asks, did those Phanariots who supported the revolution see themselves as Hellenes or Romei, or a combination of both? Did you have an answer for that?
Yeah, thanks, Konstantin. Good question, actually, because really, because the many Phanariots had embraced the Enlightenment so strongly, they sort of adopted a Hellenic identity over a Roman identity. So in my opinion, they probably lean more to being Hellenic, especially as they were such supporters of the revolution to begin with. So yeah, great question though.
Awesome, thank you. And a question from George Nikolakopoulos. Despite there being presented the notion of myth history, do you believe that many patriotic myths that surround the Greek Revolution and Hellenism still have a place in our modern world? And should these continue to be somewhat embraced, in your opinion?
In my own opinion, I think all viewpoints do have a place in the world, especially about bringing whole discussions. So yeah, if we completely wipe out myths, there will be no greater discussion of what is true and what is not. So I think there is some importance, and it's probably a good way as well to introduce people to the topic, to start with some of these base myths that we learn. But yeah, it is also good to discuss that they are myths as well. So I think they're important for discussion purposes, definitely.
Yeah, I think it's good to also get younger children involved in history, but like you said, to actually acknowledge that they are myths and to delve into the actual history. Maria Toscas asks, it is interesting to note that the myth history associated with the secret schools. It is interesting to note the myth history associated with the secret schools. I have been to Greece and have been taken to what were believed at the time to be secret schools. Given your comments that these schools are no longer discussed in history in Greece, have these sites also been reviewed or removed? So has that history kind of been looked at and reviewed?
I'm not really 100% sure, because this was sort of new knowledge to me in the past few months while I started researching this. I'm not sure if Nick Dallas might have some more to say about this, maybe. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure, as it's new knowledge to me as well.
Okay. Nick, did you have any answers to that?
Yeah, all I'd like to say, look, this debate has taken place over the last few decades. With regards to specific monuments, whether let's say the placards have been removed, I'm not sure, but definitely they have been removed from history books and so forth, and acknowledging that it is a myth. So yeah, but I can't comment on specific sites. And yeah.
Thank you, Nick and Yianni. We'll go to another question by Constantine again. Why did I'm going to pronounce this wrong, my apologies, Euseminal Patriarch and the monks of Mount Athos refused to support the revolution? What are your views?
So I probably talked about that a little bit at the end. Probably one reason, I'm sure there was probably a range of reasons why they refused to support the revolution, but one major factor was that, in a sense, they were a privileged class that did have a very sort of, more privileged and well-to-do lifestyle than the average Greek. So for them to give up that that lifestyle for a revolution that they weren't sure was going to happen or be successful in the first place was probably why they refused to support. I'm sure there is a range of reasons as well that you could probably delve into. There's probably huge studies done, and I'm sure thesis is written on this. But yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Yianni, and thank you for that question. Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Can I just also add, those, let's say, Greeks who are a privileged class in the Ottoman Empire, at least outwardly, they couldn't be seen as supporting the revolution. And to a certain extent, they had to remain fence sitters because they didn't really know which way the revolution was going to go. There were previous attempts at unsuccessful revolutions too, so maybe some of them would have been biding their time as well. So.
Thank you, Nick. I'll move on to another question from John Katsoulis. What was the role of the Janissaries? Who were they loyal to over the centuries?
So yeah, I don't know a lot about the Janissaries, but I do know that they were an elite force, trained from childhood often, and kind of served as the elite force of the Ottoman army. They were loyal to the Ottomans, but obviously during this decade is when there was the Janissary revolt, the auspicious incident, and when they revolted against their rulers, I guess. Nick might have a little bit more to add on that one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely can add on that. Over time, the Janissary Corps became less effective. Who they were loyal to? They were mainly loyal to themselves. They also became a privileged class because they weren't paying taxes. Later on, they formed artisan guilds, and they were a bit of a protected shop, didn't want sort of competition in their areas as well. And one of the reasons you had that result, and it's actually the Sultan themselves that ordered Ottoman troops to attack him, was that the Ottoman Turkey wanted to modernize their army along sort of European lines, become an army. They were resistant to that because it also meant losing their sort of privileges. So initially, yes, they were effective, but over time, they lost their sort of potency and effectiveness.
Thank you, Nick. We'll go to another question in the chat from Maria Atlas White. She says, I did my schooling in Greece and we were taught that Bouboulina was Greek fighting for the Greek cause. Thank you for clarifying this. How would Bouboulina see/consider herself, Greek or Albanian?
I personally believe because she was fighting for the Greek cause, she probably identified stronger as a Greek, as many Avanitas did during that period. They did speak a different language, but they also shared a religion and a region that they lived in. So yeah, she probably considered herself a Greek, but still today, I think there's a lot of questions in the Avanite community of Greece of what is their identity. And I'm sure I'm probably not the one to answer for them, but yeah, I'm sure there's a range of different opinions today with Avanitas.
Let me just say, we have to...
Oh, sorry, could I jump in and just ask, adding to Marie's question, are you kind of implying that there is no hard evidence of how she identified herself?
There might be somewhere written. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, she had a probably good sense of a Hellenic identity.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of these figures had multiple identities at the same time as well. They probably had their local identity, their regional identity, even a familial identity, as well as their overarching Hellenic identity. So they probably were going between different identities for different situations, I believe. Yeah.
Of course, thank you. And Nick was going to add to that.
Yeah. I just have to, we have to also put this in context. I mean, the way we view identity today would have been very different to the way they viewed their identity sort of 200 years ago. So let's be careful not to make that direct comparison. You aren't really comparing apples with apples either. And but to Yianni's point, the fact that she fought for the Greek cause there was that sort of common element there of Greek identifications.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And there is a question from Facebook from Maria Macris. She says, apart from Bouboulina, were there any other female players that we should be aware that have made a considerable contribution during the revolution?
There definitely were. Sadly, as is the way with history, often we see the same male names being listed. It's the way history is being recorded. So there's less obviously said on females because of past perceptions of females and their roles in society. There's a new wave of study now on females in history, and I'm sure there's a lot on females in the revolution. And this is probably something I should bring into the next part actually and research further. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Maria, I'm very glad you asked that question, because one of the seminars on the 11th of March is on Mandon Mavroyenos. So I won't elaborate any further, but please come to that seminar. So everyone tends to hear of Bouboulina, but we hear very little of the other sort of female characters who played a dominant role in the revolution. Yeah.
Amazing. I don't see any further questions on our Zoom chat. Nick, was there any more coming from Facebook at the moment?
I haven't seen any. Costa sends us a few. Okay, let me check. No, I don't see any. So.
Okay.
Okay, there's a question that just came in from John Katsoulis on the chat.
Yep, John Katsoulis wants a bit of information on the role of Jews in the revolution.
There were lots of Jews living in Greece in the Ottoman Empire. They definitely were mentioned as parts of cities that were conquered. There was always a Jewish quarter or a Jewish population. I haven't read anything specific on Jews being involved in the revolution. I have actually seen a lot of anti-Semitic literature from the period coming from the Greek revolutionary side. So there wasn't a clear understanding or alignment there in their views. And there was a massacre that I will talk about next week that included Jewish women and children as well. So yeah, there's definitely an interesting thing to research, and I'm sure you probably could find some good research that's already been done on that as well.
Thank you for your answer for that, Yianni. I don't see Q&A. Oh, there is another question. Apart from Laskarina Bouboulina and Mando Mavroyenos, were there any other female players that we should be aware that have made a considered contribution during the revolution? So apart from those two, are there any others that we're aware of? Nick or Yianni?
I think that Yianni said that's his homework, so for next week as well.
Okay, beautiful. So Maria, make sure you tune in next week when we elaborate a bit further in part 2. At this stage, I don't see any further questions. So did we want to stay on for a few more minutes, Nick, to wait, or wrap it up at this stage?
Yeah, I just want to add, Michael Barbayannis just, I think it's more a comment rather than a question. He says, firstly, there's no portrait of Bouboulina. Secondly, she was both economic and cultural. The question of nationality.
I think you're cutting out, Nick. You've cut out for us.
No, I've just read out the comment. Yeah, sorry.
Nick, you're cutting out. Denise,
Okay, I'm saying it was more.
Oh.
It was more comment rather than a question from Michael Barbayanis. He was stating that the question of Bulbulina's ethnic identity is sort of immaterial. The main thing is that she was fighting a common enemy, seeking independence, both economic and cultural. So it's
yeah, I'd say that's a fair point. The yeah, I guess she's fighting for her to have a nationality before the nation of Greece existed was, in a sense, impossible anyway. So yeah, she was more the idea and the that she was fighting for at that point in time, definitely.
Yeah. Do you have anything further?
Can I just add, if you have any further questions, feel free either to send them to NUGAS or to the Greek community at info@greekcommunity.com.au, and over the course of the week, Yianni can sort of provide answers as well if some questions you think of later on. So yeah.
We've just received one more question that's from Facebook, and that question is, was the 70,000 that marched to Bucharest called the Ieros Logos, made famous by the poem of Andreas Calvos? Do you know anything about that, Yianni?
No, I don't actually. So if anyone else does, it's definitely another thing I'll look up and yeah, try to provide an answer with as well. Maybe next week. Yeah.
Not sure if Nick, you had an answer to that. Otherwise, I'm sure that at some stage in this
I don't, and might I say that Yianni's only at the beginning of his PhD, so we can excuse him. If he had completed his PhD, we might not have been as lenient, but we'll get back to Georgia. We'll get back to you on that question. Yeah.
Beautiful. Alrighty, and I'll just echo what Nick said. So if you have any further questions, please feel free to send them through to either the NUGAS email or Facebook page, or the Greek Community of Melbourne Facebook page or email also. And I think we'll wrap it up at this stage. I just wanted to say once again, a big thank you to Yianni for all your research. It was really, really informative, and I think a really great background for everyone, basically, for people that don't know anything at all about the revolution to people that do have lots of knowledge still. So thank you very much. Thank you again, GCM, Bill, Nick, Marinis, and the rest, Kostas, for facilitating this. And I guess at this stage, we'll end this seminar. Was there any closing remarks you wanted to make, Eleni, Nick, or Bill? No? All good? Alrighty. Well, thank you once again, everyone. And please also tune into our second part of our seminar, which is next week. Yianni will be presenting again. And yeah, that's it from us tonight. Thank you very much, everyone.